Billionaire leaves the hospital, desperate after discovering he has little time left to live. But two twins surprise him by saying, "We know how to save you." The clock on the consulting room wall read 2:47 in the afternoon when Richard Calloway's life changed forever. He watched the hands move with cruel precision, while Dr. Peterson's words still echoed in his ears. "I'm sorry, Mr. Calloway. The results are conclusive." Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie, an automatic gesture he resorted to whenever he needed to regain control. At 40, he had never lost, not once. He was the man who turned a small investment into a billion-dollar empire, who navigated economic crises as if strolling through a park on a sunny day, who made competitors bow with a single phone call. "How long?" he asked, his voice steadier than he expected. The doctor hesitated, a bad sign, and Richard recognized hesitations. They preceded the kind of news no one wanted to deliver. Months, maybe less. Richard stared at the doctor with the same look he used during tough negotiations, searching for a loophole, some margin to counterattack. There was none. "What about experimental treatments?" "We've considered them all. This condition is extremely rare. The progression is relentless." Richard nodded as if he were merely receiving a financial report that came in below expectations. He took the envelope with the test results, stood up, and shook the doctor's hand. Mechanical gestures from a man who had always known exactly what to do, even when receiving the worst news. Only this time there was no strategy to outline. No plan B. No hostile takeover or creative merger to reverse the situation. In the mirrored hospital elevator, Richard studied his reflection, the perfectly tailored suit, the platinum watch, the handmade Italian shoes. Not a single hair was out of place, even now. The perfect image of success that he had cultivated for decades. The elevator stopped on the ground floor and the doors opened. Richard hesitated for a moment before leaving, something he never did. Hesitation meant losing opportunities, and he had built his fortune precisely by never hesitating. On the sidewalk in front of the hospital, his driver was already waiting with the limousine door open. Richard made a dismissive gesture. "I'll walk, James. Take the rest of the day off." The driver, accustomed to never questioning him, simply nodded and left, leaving Richard alone on the busy Manhattan sidewalk. He started walking aimlessly. People in a hurry brushed against him, murmuring automatic apologies without looking up. Executives speaking loudly on their phones, tourists consulting maps, delivery workers rushing against time, a world spinning at full speed, just as Richard had taught it should. Efficiency, productivity, results. He was waiting at a red light when reality hit him full force, a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his illness, his empire, his fortune, his legacy, all that would remain after he was gone. But for what? And for whom? Richard crossed the street and kept walking, this time paying attention to the people around him. Couples holding hands, friends laughing in front of cafes, parents playing with their children, connections, the same ones he had sacrificed in the name of success. He remembered his ex-wife and Caroline. 10 years of marriage ended with an impeccable prenuptial agreement and a conversation shorter than 20 minutes. She had said something that, at the time, had seemed absurd. "You have everything, Rick, except what really matters." Rick. No one called him that anymore. Not even his parents, who were both deceased. He would rarely contact them except on special occasions or when he needed to appear at some family event to keep up appearances. He walked into a small plaza and sat on a bench. From his pocket, he took out his cell phone and saw dozens of notifications, urgent emails, messages from assistants, meeting reminders. The machine that never stopped, which he had programmed to operate at full throttle. With his thumb, Richard scrolled through the list of contacts on his phone, hundreds of names, partners, clients, lawyers, accountants, managers, assistants, chefs, personal trainers. Whom could he call right now? Who would actually listen beyond professional obligations? The answer was as clear as it was painful. No one. The last rays of afternoon sun painted the skyscrapers gold as Richard finally realized the cruel irony of his life. He had won every battle, but he was losing a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. The man who could buy anything discovered, at last, that there are indeed things money can't buy. Not really. Off in the distance, an elderly couple walked hand in hand. They had to be significantly older than his 40 years, yet they seemed to have something that, despite his fortune, he had never achieved. Richard looked at the envelope of test results in his hand, months, maybe less. For the first time since his childhood, he felt tears forming, not from fear or self-pity, but from a shattering clarity. He had wasted his life accumulating things that now meant nothing, and the worst part, it might be too late to change. His phone vibrated again. His assistant, reminding him of the meeting with Japanese investors, scheduled for an hour from now. Richard turned off the device. For the first time in 20 years, the most punctual man in Manhattan was about to miss an appointment. And for the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to do next. He only knew that he needed to do something different, completely different. As he rose from the bench, one question echoed in his mind. How do you truly live when you find out you only have a few months to do it? Richard Calloway, the man who never lost, was about to find out. Richard walked for hours, crossing familiar streets that now felt strange. The sun was setting when his steps led him to a small park, hidden among buildings. One of those green spaces that miraculously survive amid the city's concrete. It wasn't a park as fancy as those he frequented for his morning runs with his personal trainer. It was a simple place, with worn benches, trees needing pruning, and a small playground with equipment that could use a fresh coat of paint. Richard sat on a distant bench, watching the park, now almost empty at this hour. He felt the weight of the envelope with his test results in the inner pocket of his jacket. Ordinary paper, containing a sentence that all his wealth could not overturn. That was when he heard laughter, a crystal-clear, honest sound, very different from the calculated laughter he was used to at his corporate parties. His eyes searched the park until they found its source. Two girls were playing near a large tree. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They wore simple dresses, a bit worn but clean. They were digging the ground with sticks, utterly engrossed in the task, as if they were drawing up plans for a castle. Richard noticed they were identical. Same brown hair in slightly messy braids, same large eyes, the same smiles with little gaps where baby teeth had fallen out. "Look, it ended up looking like a castle," one of them said, pointing to the design in the dirt. "No, it looks more like a boat. See, this is the sail," said the other, drawing another line. There was something about those children that reminded him of how it felt to be young, when the future seemed endless, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. Then, as if they sensed his gaze, both girls simultaneously looked up. Their eyes locked onto his with a disconcerting intensity. Richard quickly looked away, suddenly self-conscious about watching children he didn't know. But it was too late. The girls had noticed. To his surprise, instead of walking off, they stood up and marched toward him with unwavering determination. Richard straightened himself on the bench, uncertain how to react. He wasn't used to interacting with children. In his world, they were distant creatures who appeared in insurance commercials or in the family photos of business associates. The twins stopped a few steps away, eyeing him curiously. One of them, the slightly more confident one, stepped forward, furrowing her brow as if she were pondering a complex problem. "You're sad," she said. It wasn't posed as a question. Richard was startled by her directness. He was used to hiding his emotions. Even his closest assistants rarely managed to read his moods. "How do you know?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. The second girl stepped forward, positioning herself beside her sister. "Your eyes," she stated simply. "They have the same look our goldfish had right before he died." Richard didn't know if he should laugh or be offended by the comparison. "But we know how to save you," the first girl went on, with the absolute certainty only children have. The statement, innocent yet absurd, sparked an unexpected reaction in Richard, a laugh. Brief, almost breathless, but genuine. He couldn't recall the last time he had laughed like that. Uncalculated. "Really? And how would you do that?" he asked, playing along. The girls exchanged secret looks, as if sharing a precious secret they were about to reveal, when a voice intervened. "Maya, Lily, stop bothering the gentleman." An elderly woman approached at a brisk pace. She had grey hair tied in a simple bun, wore a modest dress covered by a worn wool coat, and carried a shopping bag. "I'm sorry, sir. I hope they aren't troubling you," she said, her expression showing worry and slight embarrassment. "Not at all," Richard answered, surprising himself with his own sincerity. The woman gently placed her hands on the girl's shoulders. "These are Maya and Lily, my granddaughters. They're very sociable, sometimes a bit too much so." The girls smiled, revealing the small gaps where their teeth were missing in precisely the same spots, Richard noted. "Richard Calloway," he introduced himself, automatically extending his hand. "Esther Goldman," replied the older woman, shaking it firmly with a strength that surprised him for someone who looked around 70. "But everyone calls me Mrs. Esther." Richard noticed that she showed no sign of recognition upon hearing his name, something rare in his experience. Usually, his name triggered immediate reactions: admiration, envy, discomfort, or at least curiosity. For Mrs. Esther, apparently, he was just a stranger in the park. "They said they can save me. I'm curious," Richard said, pointing to the twins who were now whispering to each other. "Mrs. Esther smiled, a smile that reached her eyes and formed subtle wrinkles at their corners. "Those girls have pure hearts. They believe love cures everything. Maybe they're right." Something in the straightforward way she said it, without self-consciousness or sugar-coating, touched him. "Do you believe that?" Mrs. Esther paused, thinking for a moment before answering. "I've lived long enough to know that love doesn't stop death or difficulty, Mr. Calloway, but it makes them worth enduring." Richard blinked, taken aback by that unexpected dose of wisdom. "Grandma, can we show Mr. Calloway our secret spot?" asked one of the twins. Maya or Lily, he still couldn't quite tell. "If he wants to and he has the time," Mrs. Esther responded, looking at Richard with an expression that implied no expectation. On any other day, Richard would have politely declined and moved on. He had meetings to attend, emails to answer, an empire to run. But this was no ordinary day. On this day, he had received a death sentence. And suddenly, he found himself infinitely more curious about what two children might consider a secret spot than about any investor meeting. "Actually, I do have the time," he said, getting up from the bench. "Where are we going?" The twins' eyes sparkled with excitement. "It's right over there," one exclaimed. "Behind that big tree," the other added, pointing to an old oak in the corner of the park. Mrs. Esther regarded Richard with renewed interest, as if glimpsing something beyond the expensive clothes and rigid posture. "They rarely show that place to strangers," she remarked, following the girls who were already running ahead. "You must have passed their test." "And what test is that?" Richard asked, walking alongside the older woman. Mrs. Esther shrugged. "Who knows? Children have a sixth sense. They see what we adults have forgotten to see." Following that unexpected group across the park, Richard felt something odd, a faint relief, as though an invisible weight on his shoulders had lifted slightly. For the first time that day, he wasn't dwelling on his illness or his empire, or how he would spend his final months. He was merely curious about what would come next. On the following day, Richard woke up before the alarm. For the first time in years, he didn't immediately check his phone. Instead, he lay in bed, watching the early morning light filter through the automatic curtains in his penthouse apartment. He remembered the secret spot the girls had shown him the day before. It wasn't particularly remarkable to an adult, just a small space between shrubs where they had placed stones in a circle, a few wildflowers in makeshift containers, and a collection of treasures, shells, colorful pebbles, shiny bottle caps, and a broken plastic toy. "It's our magic garden," said Lily, or was it Maya, with utter seriousness. "We plant dreams here," the other added. "How do you plant a dream?" Richard had asked, half confused, half intrigued. "You close your eyes, focus really hard on what you want, and then blow on the flowers," one of them explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Mrs. Esther had simply watched with a serene smile on her face. "Does it work?" The two girls exchanged glances, apparently consulting each other on how to respond. "Sometimes it takes a while," one admitted, "but it always works," the other concluded with conviction. Now, lying in his king-size bed, Richard smiled at the memory. It was a strange and unexpectedly pleasant moment. After almost an hour of chatting, He had said his goodbyes, promising to come back, a promise offered more out of courtesy than genuine intent. Yet here he was the next morning, thinking about those children and their grandmother, their magic garden, and their simple beliefs. When his personal assistant, Coors Thomas, entered the room with breakfast and the day's schedule, Richard took him by surprise. "Cancel my afternoon appointments. All of them." Thomas hesitated, tray still in hand. "Sir, you have a board meeting at 2 and a dinner with the Chinese investors at 7. Cancel," Richard repeated, in a tone that tolerated no dispute. "Tell them I'm indisposed. A health problem." It wasn't exactly a lie. "Yes, sir," Thomas answered, setting the tray down on the table. "Anything else?" "Don't call me unless it's absolutely necessary." At 2 in the afternoon, instead of being in a conference room discussing million-dollar acquisitions, Richard Calloway was sitting on the same bench in that small park. Today he wore more casual clothes, cotton slacks and a simple shirt, although both cost more than most people earned in a week. The park was empty, except for a few mothers with babies and an elderly couple feeding pigeons. There was no sign of the twins or Mrs. Esther. Richard waited for almost an hour, feeling increasingly foolish. What was he doing here, waiting for two children he'd barely met? He was about to leave when his phone rang. Thomas, informing him of a crisis with one of their projects in Asia, normally the kind of situation that would send him rushing back to the office. But today, Richard merely gave basic instructions and hung up. He decided to wait another 15 minutes before heading off. 15 minutes turned into 30, then an entire hour. The sun was beginning to set when he finally admitted that no one was coming. He felt a twinge of disappointment that surprised him with its intensity. The following day, the same scenario. Richard appeared at the park, waited for hours, and nothing. The sense of disappointment was even stronger. "What am I doing?" he murmured to himself as he walked back home. "I have an empire to run, and I'm wasting time waiting for two kids I barely know." Even so, on the third day, he was there once again, this time earlier, right after lunch. The sky was cloudy, hinting at rain, which perhaps explained the park being nearly empty. That was when he heard the sound of childish laughter approaching. He turned in time to see Maya and Lily entering the park, hand in hand, with Mrs. Esther. The three came to a stop upon seeing him, the girls' faces showing surprise that quickly turned into beaming smiles. "You came back," Maya exclaimed, releasing her grandmother's hand and running to him. "I knew you'd come back," Lily added, following her sister. The two stopped in front of him, gazing at him with those big, inquisitive eyes. Richard felt something strange in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite identify, a blend of relief and joy. For a moment, he almost forgot how to speak. Yes, I'm back," he finally managed, trying to sound casual. "I thought maybe I could learn a bit more about this cure you mentioned." Mrs. Esther approached more slowly, carrying a shopping bag. "I'm sorry we weren't here yesterday or the day before," she said. "The girls caught a cold and needed to rest." I didn't expect," Richard stammered, feeling ridiculously exposed. "I just happened to be passing by today." Mrs. Esther smiled as though she didn't believe it, but was too polite to contradict him. "I'm glad we bumped into each other then," she said simply. "Girls, don't bombard Mr. Calloway with all your questions at once." "Can we show him the leaves we collected, Grandma?" asked one of the twins. "If he has time." Richard automatically checked his watch, then remembered he had cancelled all his afternoon meetings. For the third time in a row, much to the dismay of Thomas and the legal department. "I have time," he answered, surprised by how easy it was to say. The girls cheered, each grabbing one of his hands and practically dragging him toward their magic garden. Mrs. Esther followed with a serene smile. For the next hour, Richard Calloway, the man who decided the fate of companies with a simple nod of his head, sat on the ground among the plants, paying close attention, while two children explained the difference between oak and maple leaves, showed him how to make a little boat with leaves and twigs, and discussed seriously whether squirrels have good table manners. He couldn't recall the last time he had sat on the ground or paid such close attention to details so insignificant. It felt strangely liberating. "What's your favorite color, Mr. Calloway?" Lily asked. He was beginning to tell them apart. Lily had a small freckle near her right eye. Blue, he answered automatically, then hesitated. Actually, I don't know. I've never really thought about it. The twins looked at him as if he had said something completely incomprehensible. Everyone has a favorite color, declared Maya, and a favorite food, a favorite animal, and a favorite season, Lily added. And you need to know what yours are, Maya said quite seriously. It's important. Richard smiled. And why is it important? Because then you know what makes you happy, Lily replied, as though it were obvious. It seemed simple when she said it like that. On the 4th day, Richard returned, on the 5th too, and on the 6th. That became his new routine. Afternoons in the park with Maya, Lily, and often Mrs. Esther. His assistant stopped asking about his absences in the afternoons, accepting the vague explanation of medical appointments, which wasn't entirely untrue. He was seeking a cure, even if not in a conventional way. With every visit, the girls had something new to show or teach him. One particularly windy day, Maya asked him to close his eyes. Listen, she instructed. Richard complied, feeling slightly foolish. Listen to what? He asked after a few seconds. The sound of the leaves in the wind, she replied, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to pay attention to that. Richard kept his eyes closed and tried to listen. At first, he could only hear the distant roar of traffic, the occasional honk and the general buzz of conversations in the park. But then, gradually, he began to distinguish a gentle rustling, almost musical, as the wind passed through the leaves. It was lovely, simple, ephemeral, but somehow perfect. Did you hear it? Maya asked, excited. Richard opened his eyes and found her watching him intently. Yes, he answered honestly. I heard it. On another day, Lily brought a small container of strawberries. Grandma made jam yesterday and these were left over, she explained, offering him some. They're from Mr. Peterson's farm stand at the market. He says they're happy strawberries. Richard hesitated. He couldn't recall the last time he ate something that wasn't prepared by his chef or meticulously vetted by his nutritionist. Happy strawberries? He asked, taking one. Yes, because they grow in the sun and with music, Lily said seriously. Mr. Peterson plays the violin for his plants. Grandma says it's nonsense, but he swears it makes a difference. Richard took a bite, surprised by the burst of flavor. It was sweet with a hint of tartness and infinitely tastier than the perfectly uniform strawberries his chef imported. This is really good, he commented, genuinely surprised. It's because you're sharing, Lily replied, as though that explained everything. Things taste better when you share them. Richard thought about that as he finished the strawberry. How many luxurious meals had he eaten alone, either in starred restaurants or in his empty penthouse? However perfect the preparation, he had never felt the simple pleasure of sharing a snack with someone. Another day, while watching a bird build a nest, Maya suddenly asked, Mr. Calloway, why are you always alone? The question caught him off guard. I'm not alone right now, he replied, trying to evade the topic. But before you met us, she insisted. Lily and I have each other, and we have Grandma. Who do you have? Richard opened his mouth to answer, but realized he had no easy response. He had assistants, lawyers, a chef, a driver, a personal trainer, a cleaning staff. But nobody he could genuinely call family or close friend. I have many people who work for me, he finally said. But that's not the same as having someone, Lily observed, joining the conversation. Grandma says we need people who love us just for who we are, not for what we do. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Your grandmother is a wise woman, he managed to say. During one of those afternoons, as Mrs. Esther watched him interact with the twins, she remarked, You're good with children, Mr. Calloway. Have you ever thought of having your own? Richard looked at the twins, who were deeply engrossed in building a fairy house with twigs and stones. There was a time I thought about it, he admitted, but then work got in the way, the business grew, and it never seemed like the right time. Mrs. Esther nodded without judgment. Life rarely gives us perfect timing. We have to create those moments where we are. Richard pondered that phrase on his way back home. He'd spent his life deferring moments, waiting to have enough success, enough money, enough time. And now, with so little time left, In his penthouse that night, Richard opened the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out the medical tests he had stored there. He reread the diagnosis, the timelines, the explanations about the disease's progression. For the first time since receiving the news, he didn't just feel despair. There was something else, a growing resolve. If he had only months left, he would use every day, not just waiting for a cure that would never come, but living in a way he never had before. The next day, when he arrived at the park, he brought a surprise. A small picnic, with sandwiches he had made himself, an adventure that involved burning the first attempt and a frantic YouTube search for how to make simple sandwiches. "You always share with me," he told the surprised twins. I figured it was my turn to share something. The sandwiches weren't perfect, the bread was a bit too toasted, and he'd gone overboard with the mayonnaise. But Maya and Lily's smiles upon tasting them made it feel like the most successful meal he had ever prepared. Each day offered a new lesson, small and simple, which under other circumstances Richard would have deemed trivial. But now, with the hourglass of his life running out faster and faster, these tiny joys seemed to hold all the meaning he had spent a lifetime searching for in the wrong places. The alarm rang promptly at 5:30 in the morning, as always. Richard opened his eyes immediately, years of discipline having eliminated those moments of confusion most people have upon waking. He was in his king-size bed, wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets with a thread count of 1,000, in the master bedroom of his 2-story penthouse overlooking Central Park. For a few seconds, he lay there, gazing at the minimalist, elegantly designed ceiling created by a renowned Japanese architect. Then the previous day's memories came rushing back. The diagnosis, the aimless walk, the park, the twins, his promise to return. A promise made thoughtlessly, more as social courtesy than genuine intention. The girls would probably not even remember him. Richard pushed off the sheets and got up, going about his meticulously timed morning routine. 30 minutes on the treadmill, a shower, breakfast prepared by the chef who came 3 times a week to leave pre-made meals. While eating his egg white omelette with spinach and organic cheese, he reviewed the day's schedule sent by his personal assistant, Thomas. 8:30, conference call with Japanese investors. 10:15, meeting with the legal department. 12, lunch with the CEO of Westmont Holdings. 2:30, new expansion project presentation. 4:45, meeting with public relations. 7, charity dinner at the Rockefeller Foundation. A typical day, a day he had planned before the diagnosis, before he knew he was dying. Richard checked his watch. Exactly 12 minutes before the driver arrived to take him to the office. Enough time to take his new medications, those that wouldn't cure him but might buy him a few precious extra weeks. While swallowing the pills, he thought back to the twins in the park, Maya and Lily, identical twins with inquisitive eyes and open smiles. "We know how to save you," they had said with the absolute conviction only children possess. Ridiculous, of course. Childish fantasies, and yet there was something about them, a rare genuineness that intrigued him. And about their grandmother, Mrs. Esther, who treated him without the reverence or discomfort his name and status usually evoked, who stated, with disarming simplicity, that love cures everything. The intercom sounded, announcing the driver's arrival. Richard picked up his briefcase, adjusted his Italian silk tie, and headed out, leaving behind thoughts of parks, children, and impossible cures. The day went exactly as planned. Meetings, negotiations, decisions that affected hundreds of lives and millions of dollars. Richard operated on autopilot, his body perfectly performing the role of the unyielding CEO while his mind occasionally drifted elsewhere. During a particularly dull presentation on market projections, he found himself thinking of the magic garden the twins had shown him, a simple space between shrubs, adorned with colorful stones and so-called treasures, shells, leaves, bottle caps that shone in the sunlight. Children finding beauty where adults saw only litter. Mr. Calloway. "Any questions about the third quarter projections?" Richard blinked, coming back to the present. 20 faces regarded him, waiting. "No, it seems pretty clear," he replied with his usual air of authority. "Proceed." At 3 in the afternoon, he did something unprecedented. He sent a message to Thomas. Cancel my remaining commitments for today. Personal emergency. Ignoring his assistant's immediate, "Is everything all right, sir?" Richard grabbed his jacket and left the office, leaving behind a confused conference room. 20 minutes later, he was in the same park as the day before, sitting on the same bench. He felt oddly nervous, as though he were about to give a crucial presentation to important investors, rather than just waiting for two children who might not even show up. The park was peaceful, only a handful of retirees playing chess, a nanny pushing a stroller, and a few students reading on distant benches. No sign of the twins or Mrs. Esther. Richard glanced at his watch, a discreet Patek Philippe that had cost more than many of his employees' annual salaries. He had been there for nearly an hour he might have used to seal the deal with the Korean investors or review the Tech Valley acquisition proposal. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself, standing up. He was about to leave when he heard, "Look, Lily, it's Mr. Calloway." Richard turned to see Maya pointing in his direction, her bright grin showing the gap from a missing baby tooth. Next to her was Lily, indistinguishable except for a small mole near her right eye, which he hadn't noticed before. The two ran toward him, followed at a slower pace by Mrs. Esther, who carried a shopping bag. "You came back," Maya exclaimed, stopping in front of him. "I knew he would," Lily confirmed, sharing a knowing look with her sister. Richard felt something unfamiliar in his chest, a kind of tightness, but not unpleasant, an emotion he couldn't quite name. For a moment, he was speechless. He who commanded meeting rooms full of executives and negotiated with magnates without hesitation. Yes, I came back," he finally managed, clearing his throat to hide his unease. "I thought maybe I could learn more about this cure you say you know. I'm sorry we weren't here yesterday or the day before," Mrs. Esther said as she approached. "The girls had a mild cold." Richard blinked, surprised. "How did you know I was here yesterday?" The elderly woman smiled, her eyes shining with subtle amusement. "I didn't know, but the girls predicted you would come." "And we were right," Lily cheered, hopping with excitement. "How could you possibly know?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. The twins exchanged conspiratorial glances before Maya responded, "We planted a wish in our magic garden for you to come back. And it worked." Richard couldn't help but smile. There was something in that childlike logic and the absolute sincerity of those children that could disarm even the most skeptical adult. "Well, here I am," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Do you want to see what we brought today?" Lily asked, taking his hand without hesitation. Richard let himself be led to their secret spot among the bushes, once again struck by how easily these children reached out to him. In his world, physical contact was rare. Formal handshakes, perhaps an occasional pat on the back with a colleague after closing a major deal. Never this innocent closeness. The little space looked slightly different from how he remembered. New treasures had been added, a bluish feather, a few shiny stones, a particularly large leaf. "This is Mr. Ladybug," Lily said, showing him a small rock painted like a ladybug. "He looks after our garden when we're not here." "And this is the new treasure map," Maya continued, unfolding a paper with colorful drawings. "But the treasure isn't gold." "It's not?" Richard asked, playing along. "Then what is it?" "Happy moments!" they both shouted simultaneously, bursting into laughter as though they'd shared the world's best joke. Richard couldn't help but grin. There was something contagious in their untroubled joy. The next day, and the day after that, and again the next, Richard returned to the park. It became his new habit. Afternoons spent with Maya, Lily, and often Mrs. Esther. Thomas stopped questioning his personal commitments, simply accepting the vague excuses for the irregular schedule, though Richard sensed his assistant's growing curiosity. In truth, he had quietly informed the main executives about his medical condition, without giving them details about its severity or prognosis, just enough to justify his new, erratic schedule. Experimental treatment, he would say, which, in a way, was true. Gradually, a routine settled in. Richard arrived at the park around 3 in the afternoon. The twins were usually there already, sometimes with Mrs. Esther, who brought homemade snacks or sat on a nearby bench knitting while the girls played. With each visit, the girls introduced something new, some small lesson or simple pleasure. On a particularly windy day, Maya grabbed his hand, something that still slightly unsettled him, but he was learning to accept it, and led him under a large tree. "Close your eyes," she requested. Richard hesitated. Closing his eyes in a public place was not something he was used to. It left him vulnerable. "Please," Maya insisted. He obliged, shutting his eyes and feeling a bit silly. "Now listen," she told him. "Listen to what?" he asked after a few seconds. "The sound of the leaves in the wind," she replied with childlike simplicity that disarmed him every time. Richard tried to concentrate. At first, he caught only the typical city sounds, cars in the distance, muffled voices, an occasional dog barking. But then, slowly, he began to discern a gentle rustling, almost musical, as the breeze passed through the tree above them. A sound that had probably always been there during his walks, but that he'd never truly listened to. It was beautiful. Simple, fleeting, yet somehow perfect. "Did you hear it?" Maya asked eagerly. Richard opened his eyes to see her watching him expectantly. "Yes," he replied earnestly. "I heard it. It's like the trees are talking, isn't it?" She smiled. "Grandma says if we know how to listen, nature always has something to tell us." That night, lying in his designer bed, Richard found himself trying to hear the wind in the trees of Central Park, visible from his window. The sound was muffled by the soundproof glass, but it was still there. A distant whisper he was noticing, truly noticing, for the first time. On another afternoon, Lily brought a small container of strawberries. "Grandma made jam yesterday and these were left over," she explained, offering them. "They're from Mr. Peterson's stall at the market. He says they're happy strawberries." Richard hesitated. He hadn't eaten anything not approved by his nutritionist or prepared by his personal chef in years. His body was a finely tuned machine, fueled to maximize efficiency and longevity, a bitter irony given his recent diagnosis. "Happy strawberries?" he asked, picking one up carefully. "Yes, because he talks to them while they grow," Lily said, in all seriousness. "Grandma calls it nonsense, but he swears it works." Richard bit into the strawberry, surprised once again by the vivid taste. Sweet with a slight tang, far superior to the perfectly uniform, imported strawberries served by his chef. "This is really good," he admitted, genuinely surprised. "That's because you're sharing," Lily replied, as though the reason were obvious. "Everything tastes better when you share." Richard considered how many expensive meals he'd had alone, in award-winning restaurants or his deserted penthouse. However flawless the cooking, he had never found this simple joy of sharing food with another person. When Mrs. Esther joined them, Richard found himself genuinely thanking her for the strawberries. "It was nothing," she answered with a gentle smile. "Maybe one day you'd like to try my jam. The girls say it's the best in the world, but I'm not exactly impartial." "I'd love to," Richard replied, realizing he meant it. In the following days, Richard began noticing subtle changes in himself. Little things, like looking up at the sky as he walked from the car to the office, something he never did before. Pausing for a second to listen to a street musician playing sax on the corner, smiling at the receptionist instead of merely nodding. On a particularly sunny afternoon, Richard arrived at the park and found only Maya sitting on their usual bench. "Where are Lily and your grandma?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Lily has a sore throat and Grandma stayed to take care of her," Maya explained. "But I wanted to come because I have something important to show you." She took his hand and led him to the park's pond, where ducks swam lazily. From her small backpack, she produced a paper bag with pieces of bread. "Grandma said I can only give them a little because too much bread isn't good for ducks," she explained, handing him some pieces. "Would you like to try?" Richard accepted the chunks of bread, watching as Maya tossed crumbs into the water, drawing the ducks in. "Throw yours too," she encouraged. Richard complied, feeling a strange satisfaction watching the ducks rush forward. There was something primitively gratifying about feeding another living creature. As they finished throwing the bread, small sparrows also gathered, picking up the crumbs along the pond's edge. Have you noticed how they always come back? Maya asked, watching the birds. They know where kindness is. Richard looked at the girl, astonished by the depth of that simple insight. How do they know? He asked, genuinely curious. Grandma says animals see with their hearts, Maya answered. They sense who is kind, even if the person doesn't know it yet. Richard reflected on that as he watched the small birds pecking at the crumbs near his feet. He'd never thought of himself as kind or unkind, efficient, productive, successful, respected. Yes, but kindness had never been an attribute he actively sought. Yet here he was, feeding wild birds in a city park in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, when he would normally be in a conference room debating market strategies. Strangely, it felt more important right now. The following week, Lily came alone. Maya is helping Grandma bake cookies for a school event, she explained. Want to see something new today? Sure, Richard agreed, already used to following the little teachers on his daily discoveries. Lily led him to an old oak tree in a remote area of the park. It was a grand tree, with a thick trunk and strong branches stretching in all directions. Let me guess, she said, eyeing Richard's casual outfit, which still cost more than most people's monthly salary. You've never climbed a tree? Richard chuckled. It's been over 20 years. Then it's time to try again, a voice said from behind them. Richard turned around and saw Maya approaching, carrying a small basket. I thought you were baking cookies, Lily commented. We finished early. I brought some for us to try, Maya said, lifting the basket. But first, the tree. Richard looked at the oak skeptically. I don't think this is a good idea. I have a meeting tomorrow, and showing up with a broken arm wouldn't be... You won't break anything, Lily assured him. This is the best branch for beginners. She pointed to a particularly thick, low-hanging limb. We climb it all the time, Maya added. Even Grandma tried it once. Picturing Mrs. Esther at around 70, perched in a tree was hard to believe, yet also oddly inspiring. If she could do it. All right, Richard conceded, removing his jacket and carefully handing it to Maya. But if I fall, you two will have to visit me in the hospital. The girls laughed as though he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. With their enthusiastic guidance and a few awkward attempts that would have horrified his personal trainer, Richard managed to hoist himself up onto the lowest branch. It was only about 5 feet off the ground, but it felt like an entirely different realm, like he'd entered another world. The girls scampered up as well, with the ease of those who did it often, positioning themselves on nearby branches. Now what? Richard asked, still feeling a little ridiculous but also strangely pleased with himself. Now look, Maya answered simply, pointing at the view. Richard complied. From that modest height, he could see most of the park, people strolling on the pathways, children playing near the playground, birds flitting among the trees. It wasn't a particularly grand vista, nothing like his office window on the 40th floor, but it felt special. Sitting there, viewing the world from above, he experienced a new feeling, genuine joy, free of any worries. For a moment, he wasn't the CEO of Callaway Enterprises, nor a man with a terminal diagnosis. He was just someone sitting on a tree branch on a pleasant afternoon, accompanied by 2 children who, for some incomprehensible reason, enjoyed his company. Feels good, doesn't it? Lily asked, swinging her feet in the air. Yes, Richard replied, surprised to realize he really meant it. It's very good. After climbing down, which proved considerably harder than going up, they sat on the grass near the tree and shared the cookies Maya had brought. They were simple oatmeal cookies with chocolate chips, slightly burnt on the edges, but Richard didn't remember tasting anything so satisfying in a long time. Did you both help make them? He asked, grabbing another cookie. I mixed the dough and Lily added the chocolate chips, Maya explained proudly. They're delicious, Richard praised them sincerely. The girls beamed, obviously pleased by the compliment. Mr. Callaway, Lily asked after a moment, do you have kids? The question caught him off guard. No. Why not? Maya persisted. Richard thought about Caroline, his ex-wife, and how their marriage had disintegrated once she realized she was competing with a massive corporation for his attention. How the idea of having children was perpetually postponed. First until the company was firmly established, then until it expanded internationally, Then until the Boston project was finished, always a later. It never seemed like the right time, he finally answered. The twins exchanged a look, as though that response confirmed something they already suspected. Grandma says there's never a perfect time for the important things, Lily commented. We have to make them happen with what we have. Once again, Richard was struck by the simple wisdom these children seemed to radiate. In the days and weeks that followed, those afternoons in the park became an essential part of Richard's routine. He rearranged meetings, delegated tasks he once considered non-transferable, and occasionally even worked remotely so he could be there at 3 o'clock. Each day brought a new discovery. The taste of an apple eaten directly from the local orchard near the park. The feel of fresh grass under bare feet, something he hadn't done since childhood. The delight of building a paper boat and seeing it float on the pond. One late afternoon, after a drawing session where the twins tried, without much success, to teach him how to draw animals, Maya and Lily took him to a bench with a view facing west. "Any new adventures today?" he asked, by then familiar with their unpredictability. "We're going to watch the sunset," Lily announced with the same enthusiasm most kids reserve for fireworks. "Just that?" Richard asked, surprised by the simplicity of their plan. "It's not just a sunset," Maya corrected him seriously. "It's a special event." "It happens every day," Richard observed. "That's what makes it more special," Lily explained. "They say if you watch the sunset every day, you never feel lonely." Richard frowned. "Who says that?" "Grandma," Maya responded, as if that settled everything. For them, it did. The three of them sat on the bench in relative silence, watching the sun slowly dip below the horizon and paint the sky in shades of orange, pink, and gold. Richard realized he couldn't recall the last time he had deliberately stopped to watch a sunset. He was always busy, always rushing. And now, ironically, when his time was more limited than ever, he found himself sitting quietly, observing the minutes pass as the sun descended. It felt peaceful, very different from the adrenaline of negotiations or the frenzy of the stock market, yet satisfying in a way he had never recognized before. "What are you thinking about, Mr. Calloway?" Lily asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "I'm thinking that you two are very good teachers," he replied honestly. The twins smiled, clearly pleased. "What else are we going to teach you?" Maya asked eagerly. Richard laughed. "I don't know. What else do you think I need to learn?" The girls exchanged a look that seemed to convey an entire conversation. "Lots of things," Lily finally said, with a seriousness that exceeded her years. "But we have time." Richard did not correct this sweetly naive statement. He didn't want to spoil the moment by bringing up the truth of his condition. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the horizon, where the sun was now just a thin golden line. Mrs. Esther, who had quietly joined them during the sunset, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Children have a way of reminding us what really matters, don't they?" she said softly. "Yes," Richard agreed, "though sometimes I wonder if it's too late for me to learn." The older woman smiled wisely. "It's never too late to start truly living, Mr. Calloway. The moment is always now." As the last colors of day faded from the sky, Richard reflected on her words. He had lived his entire life planning for the future, accumulating wealth that now seemed pointless in light of his terminal diagnosis. He had never truly existed in the present, appreciating the small moments that actually shape a life. Now, with time running short, he was finally learning. And his teachers were two 8-year-old girls who saw magic in the simplest things. Rustling leaves, sharing a snack, a genuine smile, the tranquility of a sunset. At that moment, with the sky now dotted by the first stars, Richard realized, maybe for the first time, that happiness resides in life's little things, precisely those he had spent his whole life dismissing in pursuit of bigger achievements. "Shall we do this again tomorrow?" Maya asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." And in that moment, he truly meant it. Meetings could wait. Contracts could wait. The world of business would keep spinning without his constant supervision. But these moments, these precious, fragile moments with Maya, Lily, and Mrs. Esther, were irreplaceable. As they walked back through the now darkened park, Richard wondered if this might be the cure the twins had promised. Not a cure for his physical disease, but for the much older malady that had plagued his soul, the inability to connect, to feel, to actually live in the present. If so, he thought, then perhaps they were keeping their promise after all. It was a Wednesday morning when Richard stepped into his office and noticed on his desk a manila envelope containing his latest test results. He had asked Dr. Peterson to send them directly here rather than to his apartment. Each week, these envelopes confirmed what he already knew. His time was dwindling. Richard opened it with the same calm method he used when opening financial reports. Numbers, charts, complex medical terms he had learned to decipher in recent months. The disease was progressing as predicted, neither faster nor slower. A pitiless efficiency that under other circumstances he might have admired. He placed the papers in a drawer and looked out through the panoramic window. From his office on the 40th floor, the city looked like a miniature model. Cars like ants, people like tiny dots, parks like green smudges in a sea of concrete. Everything so small, so distant. Except now Richard knew one of those distant dots. Actually, three: Maya, Lily, and Mrs. Esther. And that knowledge had changed everything. When his intercom buzzed, Thomas's voice came through. "Mr. Calloway, the representatives from the Community Foundation are here for the meeting." "Send them in," Richard replied, adjusting his tie. 3 people entered, 2 women and a man, each holding folders and wearing expressions of mild apprehension. Richard shook their hands and invited them to sit. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he began. "I have a project I'd like to discuss with you, something a bit different from my usual ventures." Over the next 45 minutes, Richard laid out his plan, a comprehensive renewal program for the neighborhood where Maya, Lily, and Mrs. Esther lived. Starting with the local school, expanding to the community clinic, then improving the park, extracurricular programs, all meticulously planned with precise budgets and timelines. The foundation representatives looked visibly astonished. Richard Calloway was known for his strategic donations to major institutions, research hospitals, elite universities, symphony orchestras. That kind of philanthropy brought prestige, building wings that bore his name. He had never expressed interest in community projects in lower or middle-income areas. "It's an impressive proposal, Mr. Calloway," said the Foundation's executive director, leafing through the documents. "But I admit I'm curious about your motivation. Why this particular neighborhood?" Richard hesitated. The real answer, because 2 8-year-old twin girls had taught him more about living in a few months than he'd learned in 40 years, sounded absurd. "Let's say I have a personal interest in the area," he finally offered. "And one condition, my involvement must remain anonymous." That caused some raised eyebrows. Anonymity was not something Richard Calloway typically sought. "No plaques, no press release, no ceremony," he specified firmly. "The funds will come from a private foundation with no direct link to me." After the foundation staff departed, faced with a demanding timeline and heavy responsibilities, Richard picked up his phone. "Thomas, cancel my afternoon appointments. I have somewhere to be." 2 hours later, he was at Mrs. Esther's modest apartment, sitting at the kitchen table while the twins did their homework in the living room. Over recent months, these visits had become almost as routine as his park outings. "More tea?" asked Mrs. Esther, already getting up to fetch the teapot. "Please," Richard replied, watching the older woman move around in the small but immaculately kept kitchen. There was something about that modest home that his huge luxury apartment would never have. A feeling of warmth. The walls were adorned with the twins' drawings and family photos. The shelves held well-worn books and small souvenirs. The air held the aroma of home-cooked food and the occasional echoes of laughter drifting in from the living room. As he sipped his tea, Richard noticed a stack of letters on the corner of the table. One envelope, partly visible, bore the logo of the building's management company, likely a rent increase notice. He'd observed how fast prices were rising in this part of town. Gentrification, that relentless process driving families like Mrs. Esther's out of their long-time homes. "Trouble with the rent?" he asked casually. Mrs. Esther gave a faint smile. Nothing we can't handle. We always find a way. Richard nodded, not pressing further. He knew enough to realize she had a pride as big as her heart. Helping her would require tact. The stairs must be tough on you, he commented after a moment, recalling the 3 steep flights to reach the apartment. They're good exercise, she replied with a small smile. Though on rainy days, my knees beg to differ. Ever considered moving to a ground floor place? Mrs. Esther laughed softly. Of course, just like I've considered taking a Mediterranean cruise or buying a new car, dreams are free, right? That night, alone in his penthouse, Richard looked out at the city lights below. Over time, he had realized a fundamental truth. It wasn't he who was saving the twins by spending time with them. It was the other way around. The girls had taught him to view the world with fresh eyes, to find joy in the smallest of things, to be present in the moment. Mrs. Esther, with her calm wisdom, had shown him how dignity and love could flourish despite modest circumstances. And what had he given back? Small gifts, a few hours of his time, a promise to renovate the local school that he might not live to see completed. It wasn't enough. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He placed 3 important phone calls, to his lawyer, to his real estate broker, and to Marcus, the aide he trusted with personal matters. 2 weeks later, a small miracle occurred. A single-story house in great condition, just a few blocks from the twins' school, suddenly became available for sale at an unusually affordable price. The previous owner, a corporation that happened to have done business with one of Richard's subsidiaries, decided to sell quickly. Mrs. Esther received a letter indicating she had been selected for a special housing program, enabling her to purchase the house with a minimal mortgage and monthly payments lower than her current rent. There must be some mistake, she told Richard when he visited that afternoon. I never signed up for any program like that. Maybe someone signed you up, he suggested, keeping his expression neutral. A social worker, perhaps. Mrs. Esther studied him with keen eyes. You wouldn't have anything to do with this, would you? Me? How could I? He replied, hiding a smile behind a sip of tea. She still seemed unconvinced, but the twins burst into the kitchen at that moment, saving him from more questions. Mr. Calloway, the teacher told us our school is getting a new library, Maya exclaimed. And a science lab, Lily added, with real microscopes. Really, Richard replied, feigning surprise. The principal announced at assembly that an anonymous benefactor is donating money to renovate the entire school, Maya went on, carefully pronouncing the words anonymous benefactor as if they were newly learned. Do you know who it is? Lily asked, leaning in conspiratorially. Richard pretended to think, no idea. But they sound pretty nice. The girls giggled, not for a moment suspecting that the man before them was responsible. For them, Richard was simply their friend from the park, the one they taught how to listen to leaves in the wind and feed the birds. In the weeks that followed, more small miracles occurred around the neighborhood. The community clinic got new equipment. The small local park was outfitted with safe, updated playground structures. The public library expanded its collection. To an outside observer, it looked like some anonymous philanthropist had adopted the neighborhood. Richard insisted on keeping his name out of the spotlight, routing the funds through layers of foundations and shell companies to hide their origin. He wasn't seeking recognition. He only wanted to ensure that the place where Maya and Lily were growing up would have the resources to thrive, that they would have the opportunities they deserved, that they would be safe. The concept of safety took on more importance as his time began running short. In a particularly grim consultation, Dr. Peterson was straightforward. 3 months, maybe 4 if you're lucky. The progression is accelerating. That night, Richard spent hours on his balcony, gazing at the star-dotted Manhattan sky. He thought about Maya and Lily and how quickly they had become important to him. How, unlike all his possessions, the time he spent with them couldn't be measured in dollars. He thought about Mrs. Esther, already 70. The girls were only 8. The math was merciless. What would happen if something happened to her before they became adults? Where would they go? who would care for them with the same unconditional love. That night, for the first time since his diagnosis, Richard wished for more time, not for himself, but for them. The next day, he called Henry Winters, his personal lawyer of 15 years. "We need to review my will," he said the moment Henry picked up, "and talk about setting up some trusts. Urgent." "Any particular reason for the rush?" Henry asked, used to Richard's typical meticulousness. "Yes, it's a matter of time." In Henry's elegant office, Richard explained what he wanted: to create educational funds for the twins so they could attend top universities one day, to establish a lifetime pension for Mrs. Esther under the guise of a scholarship program, and most importantly, to designate backup guardians in case anything happened to their grandmother before they reached adulthood. "That's unusual," Henry commented, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the notes. "May I ask who these people are? Distant relatives?" "No," Richard responded simply. "They're people who became important to me." Henry nodded, used to his client's reticence. "And you want all this managed in the strictest confidence?" "Absolute," Richard confirmed. "I don't want them knowing the money came from me, especially the girls." "May I ask why?" Richard stared out the window, considering the best way to phrase it. "Because what they've given me is priceless, and I don't want them thinking I'm trying to buy something or make amends." Henry, having known Richard long enough to sense when not to pry further, simply nodded and continued with the paperwork. In the following weeks, Richard discreetly worked with Henry to finalize an extensive plan. It was complex, creating legal structures that would remain in place after his death, ensuring the funds were properly managed, adding safeguards to protect the girls from potential exploitation. During this period, he decided to do something he'd never considered before: truly get to know the community where Mrs. Esther and the twins lived. Not just the park or their school, but the entire neighborhood. One Sunday, feigning casual interest, he asked Mrs. Esther to show him around. She seemed surprised but agreed. They walked the streets, the twins running ahead, while the elderly woman pointed out local landmarks: the bakery where they bought bread on Saturdays, the small craft shop run by a Korean immigrant family, the community hall that hosted parties and meetings. Richard took it all in with fresh eyes. He saw the challenges: dilapidated buildings, cracked sidewalks, few recreational facilities. But he also saw the community spirit: neighbors greeting each other by name, children playing on the sidewalks, seniors tending small community gardens. It was a place where people knew each other, where they cared. So different from the sterile, isolated world he had built for himself. "I like it here," he commented sincerely as they stopped to buy ice cream for the twins. Mrs. Esther smiled. "It's not fancy, but it's a good place to raise children. Folks help each other out." Richard nodded, a new idea forming in his mind. That night, he added yet another item to the list of arrangements he was making: a substantial community fund managed by local leaders to be used for projects chosen by the residents themselves. It wouldn't be mere charity handed down from above, but resources for the people to use as they saw fit. The kind of approach he would never have considered before meeting Maya and Lily, before realizing the value of genuine human connections. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Richard continued splitting his time between the corporate world he had built and the simpler, more authentic world introduced to him by the twins. To his co-workers, it seemed as though he was simply delegating more tasks, a shift in management style, perhaps. To Maya, Lily, and Mrs. Esther, he was just Richard, the friend who came over for snacks, walks in the park, and unpretentious chats. No one except Henry and Dr. Peterson knew the full truth, that Richard was quietly preparing a legacy. Not of buildings bearing his name or headlines in financial newspapers, but of security and opportunities for two girls who had taught him how to truly live. One pleasant afternoon, while they all watched a local amateur baseball game in the park, Lily suddenly asked, "Mr. Calloway, are you happy?" The direct question, so profound in the way only children can be, caught Richard off guard. "Right now?" he asked after a pause. "Yes, I'm happy now." "But before meeting us," Maya pressed, joining the conversation, Richard thought about life before them, Endless meetings, business dinners, private jet trips. The respect laced with fear he saw in the eyes of employees and competitors, the material trophies he'd amassed. "I think I was so busy trying to be successful that I forgot to be happy," he said honestly. The twins nodded, as if that made complete sense. "Grandma says being truly rich means having people you love," Lily remarked. "And who love you back," Maya added. Richard felt a strange pang in his chest. Not physical pain, but a deep emotion he was still learning to name. He looked at these two little girls by his side, at their innocent faces and open smiles, and felt a certainty settle within him. His greatest investment hadn't been in stocks, real estate, or companies, nor even in the substantial donations he was making. His greatest investment had been in something money couldn't buy: love, something he'd never truly had before, neither given nor received. Richard decided he needed to leave something for them, something more than money or opportunities, a part of himself, a legacy that transcended his physical presence. He consulted an attorney about creating educational trusts for the girls, ensuring they would have everything they needed to thrive, all without them ever knowing the money came from him. But as the documents were being prepared and the trust funds established, Richard did something more important. He spent time with them. He listened to their stories, answered their questions, shared small daily joys. He was present, truly present, in a way he had never been for anyone in his life. He realized with a clarity that only arises when time is short that this might be the most valuable gift he could offer. The leaves turned golden and swirled through the air as Richard walked slowly up the stone path that led to Mrs. Esther's porch. A sharper pain in his bones made every step feel like a monumental effort, but he refused the cane his doctor had recommended. He didn't want to worry the girls more than necessary. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of medical appointments, all confirming what his body already knew. The illness was advancing faster than initially anticipated. Dr. Peterson had not sugarcoated the news at their last meeting. "We're talking weeks now, Mr. Calloway, a month at best given the progression." A crimson leaf drifted onto Richard's shoulder. He paused to lift it gently, admiring its intricate veins. Before meeting the twins, he likely wouldn't have even noticed the leaf, let alone appreciated its beauty. It was astounding how much his view of the world had shifted in just a few months. Seated on the porch in the spot that had become his favorite, Richard watched Mrs. Esther watering hanging plants. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light over everything, transforming the ordinary into something almost sacred. Such were his days now. Every ordinary moment turned precious by his acute awareness of impermanence. "The girls should be home from ballet class soon," Mrs. Esther commented, setting the watering can aside and taking a seat in the rocking chair next to him. "They're so excited about their end-of-year show, even though it's still 2 months away." Richard nodded, feeling that familiar ache in his chest. 2 months, a future he wouldn't share with them. The thought, once terrifying, now felt quietly sad. "I'd really like to see them dance," he said softly. Mrs. Esther looked at him, noticing the shadow that passed over his face. With her usual perceptiveness, she understood the unspoken. "The news from the doctor wasn't good," she stated, not as a question but with gentle understanding. Richard met her gaze, those wise eyes that always seemed to see through facades. "Weeks, maybe a month," he confirmed, voice steadier than he expected. "It's progressing quickly now," she nodded, absorbing that news with the calm dignity she always showed when facing hardship. There were no exclamations of shock or hollow assurances that he'd pull through, just compassionate acceptance, which he greatly valued. "How do you feel about that?" she asked, an honest question most people wouldn't dare pose, assuming the answer was obvious. Richard considered carefully. "Strangely, at peace," he finally said. "More than I thought I'd be. There's a clarity in knowing how much time is left. Head makes every choice seem so much more important, more meaningful." The soft creaking of the rocking chairs cradled his thoughts, making it easier to articulate feelings he once would have bottled up. "You know, I spent my entire life planning ahead. The next deal, the next merger, the next quarter, the next year. Always pushing things off until the right moment that never really arrived. And now," Mrs. Esther prompted kindly. "Now there's only the present," Richard said, watching a butterfly alight on a nearby bloom. And oddly enough, that's liberating. The silence that followed wasn't awkward but comforting, the kind of quiet only shared by people who don't feel the need to fill every pause with hollow chatter. "The girls have noticed something changing," Mrs. Esther commented at last. "They're very observant, especially with people they love." Richard felt a warm flutter in his chest at the words, "people they love." The idea of being truly loved, not for his wealth or status, but simply for who he was, still caught him off guard. "What did they say?" Lily asked why you seem more tired each time you visit. Maya wanted to know why the doctors couldn't just fix what's wrong, like they do when they get sick. "And how did you answer?" Richard asked, dreading the idea of causing the children emotional pain. "I told them the truth, as much as they can understand at their age," she replied. "That you're sick, that the doctors are doing their best, but sometimes even the best doctors can't cure certain illnesses." "How did they take it?" "Like children," Mrs. Esther said, with a small, nostalgic smile. "First, they asked direct questions, then they showed genuine concern, and then they got distracted by other things. Their grief comes in small waves, not constant like ours." Richard nodded, appreciating her insight. "Maya asked if you would go to heaven like their mum did," Mrs. Esther continued. "Lily wondered if they could visit you when you got too sick to come here." Richard felt his throat tighten. "What did you say?" "That I'm not sure about heaven," she replied, "but you would certainly live on in our hearts and memories. And yes, they could visit you if you were okay with it." "I'd like that," he said, meaning it deeply. The idea of not seeing the girls in his final days had become unbearable. He looked at the small front garden the twins had planted over the months, full of vibrant blooms arranged in patterns that made sense only to them. A tidal wave of emotion washed over him. "I wish I'd done something like this sooner," he said softly. "Learned earlier that life is more than acquisitions and money. I built an empire, accumulated more wealth than I could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, but until I met you, none of it meant anything." Mrs. Esther smiled, her gentle smile that created tiny crinkles around her eyes. "But you did learn it. That's what matters." "Too late, it seems," he lamented, bitterness creeping into his voice. "It's never too late to discover what really matters, Richard," she said firmly. "Even if it's only for a short while. Some people go their whole lives without ever finding out." Their eyes met, and Richard sensed that familiar bond between them, an understanding that went beyond his public identity, beyond his persona as a ruthless businessman. Laughter from the street outside broke the moment. Maya and Lily trotted up the path, still in their ballet outfits, faces flushed with excitement and exercise. "Mr. Calloway, you came today," Maya shouted, voice brimming with genuine delight. "We brought something to show you," Lily chimed in, holding a colorful folder. Richard smiled, feeling a warmth that momentarily dispelled his constant pain. "I can't wait to see it." The girls climbed the porch steps, carefully mindful of his fragility, then showed him the drawings they'd done in art class. "We had to draw important people in our lives," Maya explained. Lily handed him the first drawing. It was a colorful, childlike depiction of 4 figures, 2 small ones obviously representing the twins, one older with grey hair who had to be Mrs. Esther, and a man in a suit holding what looked like a book. "This is you," Lily said, pointing to the male figure. "I drew the book about constellations you gave us." Richard gazed at the drawing, feeling something break inside him. There he was, not a business mogul or billionaire, just Richard, the friend who read about stars with 2 little girls. "Look, there's more," Maya announced, showing him another drawing. It seemed to represent the park, with the same 4 figures sitting on a bench, watching what was presumably a sunset. "That's when we watch the sunset together," she explained. "Those are my favorite days." Richard gently ran his fingers over the paper, as though he could absorb the memory through touch. "Mine too," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. There were other drawings, all capturing moments that might seem ordinary to others, but which had become the most valuable memories of his life. He appeared with the girls in their magic garden, pushing them on a swing, listening to them spin elaborate tales about fairies dwelling in the park's trees. "Our teacher said there's going to be a show of our drawings at the end of the semester," Lily explained. You'll come, right? The innocent question, laden with a child's certainty that he would still be around, hit Richard like a physical blow. The end of the semester was in December, 2 months away. Before he could find words, Mrs. Esther intervened gently. "Girls, why don't you go change and wash your hands? Then you can help prepare dinner." The twins looked reluctant to leave, but Richard promised he would keep looking at their drawings until they returned. When they went inside, Richard and Mrs. Esther exchanged a gaze of mutual understanding. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "They don't fully grasp the situation." "Don't apologize," Richard replied. "Their innocence is comforting in a way. In their world, I can actually be there in December." Dusk fell, casting the porch in soft shadows as garden lights flickered on, adding a slight magic to the scene. Richard spotted the season's first fireflies, their little lights blinking like mobile stars. "When I'm gone," he began, voice low, "I'd like you to watch for something for me. Among the documents with my lawyer, there's provision for the girls' financial security, education, healthcare, everything they might need well into adulthood, but money can't buy one thing." "And what is that?" Mrs. Esther asked. "Memories," he answered plainly. "I'd like you to talk about me to them sometimes, not as the rich or powerful man I used to be, but as the friend who learned too late what really matters in life." Mrs. Esther reached out and took his hand gently. "I promise." Richard's time was visibly running short. His good days were fewer, his bouts of energy briefer. Yet he persisted in maintaining his relationship with the twins, adapting to new limitations. When he could no longer go to the park, they came to his apartment, changing the austere ambiance with their laughter. When reading grew too hard under his pain medication, they read to him, effortlessly switching roles. One particularly lovely Sunday afternoon, against medical advice that insisted on bed rest, Richard surprised everyone by showing up at the small municipal park where everything began. His driver, James Dice, worried about leaving him alone, finally relented when Richard insisted, "I'll be among friends. Come back in 2 hours." More frail than ever, leaning on an elegant dark wood cane that Maya had decorated with star stickers, for good luck, Richard made his way to a secluded bench. From there, he watched the twins playing, unseen at first. His time was almost gone. On one of his last days, he went to the park alone, quietly observing the twins from afar. He knew he would soon be unable to be there at all, yet felt at peace. There was serenity in that silent observation, as if he were absorbing the scene to take with him. Maya leading some make-believe game with animated gestures, Lily more methodical, organizing leaves and stones in precise patterns, Mrs. Esther overseeing them from a distance, knitting in her lap while watching her granddaughters with quiet affection. Eventually, Maya looked up and spotted him. Her face lit up instantly. "Mr. Calloway," she shouted, waving excitedly before dashing toward him. Lily, hearing her sisters shout, turned around as well, her face breaking into a radiant smile. The girls approached more slowly than usual, sensing his frailty even though none of them spoke it aloud. "We came early today because the sky's so pretty," Lily said, pointing at the vibrant blue overhead. "And because Maya had a dream you'd be here," added Mrs. Esther, who had joined them carrying her knitting and a small book. "It was a really real dream," Maya confirmed solemnly. "I saw you sitting on this very bench." Richard smiled. "You must have a special talent then." "Grandma says sometimes our hearts know things our heads haven't learned yet," Maya explained, sitting carefully beside him, wary of jostling him. "Your grandma is a wise woman," Richard said, meeting Mrs. Esther's gaze with gratitude. That afternoon they engaged in calmer activities. Rather than running around like usual, they spent their time identifying shapes in the clouds, gathering interesting leaves, and listening to Mrs. Esther read a chapter from a book about star myths, one Richard had given the girls. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with pink and gold, Richard felt a deep inner peace. He was exhausted. His pain was worse than he let on, his weakness more severe than he revealed, yet his spirit felt calm, as though he had found a place where he belonged. "Will you join us for dinner tonight?" asked Mrs. Esther, noting his fatigue but respecting his dignity by not pointing it out directly. "I'd like that," Richard replied, knowing he could barely eat anymore. In recent days, his appetite had nearly vanished, but spending more time with them was too precious to decline. Mrs. Esther's home, always welcoming, seemed especially cozy that evening. Soft lighting, the aroma of homemade stew, a table set with care. Simple touches that combined to form the essence of home Richard had never truly experienced, not even in his privileged childhood. During dinner, the girls led the conversation, chattering about school, friends, and upcoming plans. Richard listened intently, savoring every word, every inflection, every laugh like a treasured gift. "Mr. Calloway," Maya suddenly asked during a lull, "do you have any photos of when you were a kid, like us?" The question took him by surprise. "A few, yes. Why do you ask?" "We're doing a school project about how people change over time," Lily explained. "Everyone's bringing pictures from when they were little. We wanted to see what you looked like," Maya added. "I bet you were serious, like you are in newspaper photos." Richard laughed softly. "Actually, I was pretty quiet, not too different from now." "Did you have friends?" Lily asked with childlike frankness. The question touched a deep part of him. "Not many," he admitted. "I grew up pretty much alone. My parents worked a lot. Like Jason's parents in our class," Maya said. "He's always with the nanny." "I had nannies too," Richard said, a snippet of memory surfacing. "A lot of them, actually. They came and went." "You didn't like them?" Lily pressed. "Most were professional," Richard responded carefully. "They took good care of me, but they weren't affectionate, except for one. She was different." A hush fell over the table. Richard lifted his eyes from his barely touched plate to find Mrs. Esther watching him intently, an indescribable expression on her face. "Different how?" Maya asked. Oblivious to the sudden tension, Richard smiled faintly, remembering. "She told stories, not just reading from books, but inventing wonderful tales. And she really listened to me, like what I thought mattered, even though I was just a kid." Their gazes met again. Something in Mrs. Esther's expression triggered a faint memory in Richard, something old and blurred. "She worked for my family when I was maybe 6 or 7, he went on. "I remember she had gentle hands and a slight accent. She used to make the best hot chocolate on cold days." "What was her name?" Mrs. Esther asked, her voice taut. Richard frowned, trying to recall. "It started with an E, I think. Eleanor." "No, that wasn't it. Something more unusual." "Esther," Mrs. Esther said quietly. "Esther Goldman." The world seemed to freeze around him. Richard looked at the elderly woman seated before him, searching her time-worn face for the features of the younger woman who peopled his hazy childhood memories. "How?" he finally managed to say. "I worked for the Calloways for nearly 5 years," she explained, her voice calm despite the apparent emotion in her eyes. "From 1985 to 1990, you were the brightest, most sensitive boy I'd ever known." Richard felt stunned. All at once, a tidal wave of memories rushed in. Walks through the mansion's enormous garden with a woman who showed him birds and taught him their names. Nights when she would sit by his bed reading until he fell asleep. The feel of her gentle hands wiping his tears when his parents yet again broke a promise to attend his recital. I didn't recognize you," he said, feeling both shocked and embarrassed. "How could you?" she replied kindly. "It was a long time ago. I was only 35 then, and you were just a little boy." The twins watched the unfolding scene with wide eyes, sensing they were witnessing something momentous, even if they didn't fully comprehend. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Richard asked. "All these months?" "At first I wasn't sure it was truly you," Mrs. Esther said. "The name Calloway is fairly common, and you've changed so much. But as we spoke, I noticed certain mannerisms, expressions, the way you furrow your brow when focused, how you tilt your head slightly when you're genuinely interested." She smiled. "Then I became certain, but it felt too complicated to just bring up. And maybe, selfishly, I wanted you to like us for who we are now, not because of something that happened in the past." "You two already knew each other?" Maya asked, looking from one to the other in amazement. "A very long time ago," Mrs. Esther replied. "When Mr. Calloway was about your age, I cared for him just like I care for you." "Like a magic circle," Lily exclaimed, her eyes shimmering with the enchantment of discovery. "Our teacher said sometimes life makes perfect circles." "That's precisely it," Mrs. Esther agreed, her gaze returning to Richard. "A perfect circle." Richard tried to process this extraordinary revelation. The seemingly random universe that had placed these three individuals in his path was suddenly revealing a complex pattern, as if destiny, he murmured, voicing his thought inadvertently. From that moment on, Richard realized that his life had always been entwined with Mrs. Esther's in ways he had never imagined. The woman who tried to show love to a lonely boy had, decades later, reappeared to help a man rediscover his capacity to love. For the rest of the night, after the twins went to bed, though not before extracting a promise of more stories about little Richard the next day, Richard and Mrs. Esther sat on the porch as they often did, but now there was a deeper dimension to their bond, a more profound understanding. "Why did you leave?" Richard asked, still trying to piece everything together. "I remember one day you just weren't there." Mrs. Esther looked up at the stars before answering, "My husband, Nathan, became gravely ill. I had to care for him. But also, Amusa, I had a disagreement with your mother." "About what?" he asked, though he guessed the answer. "About you. About how I cared for you," Mrs. Esther admitted. "Your mother thought I was making you too soft, as she said, too sensitive. She wanted me to maintain a more formal relationship, less maternal." Richard shook his head, recalling how well that aligned with his mother's parenting philosophy. Eleanor Calloway believed open affection fostered weakness. "How did I react when you left?" he asked, almost fearing the response. Sadness clouded Mrs. Esther's face. "It was hard. You couldn't understand why I had to go. You promised to behave better if I would stay." Richard closed his eyes, the painful memory surfacing fully. He'd clung to Esther's leg, crying, begging, as she tried explaining she had to care for her husband. Another instance of abandonment in his young life, confirming his belief that loving someone only led to being left behind. "I tried to keep in touch," Mrs. Esther went on. "I sent letters, birthday gifts for nearly 2 years. I never got any of them," Richard said, the hurt still present, even decades later. "I suspected as much," Mrs. Esther sighed. "Your mother had very particular ideas about your upbringing." Richard nodded, more aware than ever of how those early years shaped him, a man suspicious of emotional ties, equating worth with achievements, building walls around his heart. "I never believed in coincidences," Mrs. Esther said softly. "When I saw you in that park months ago, I barely recognized the boy I knew. But something in me resonated, like a circle was closing." As he remembered the nights she soothed him to sleep, the same gentle voice, the same capable hands, Richard felt an unexpected peace settle within him, as though a fractured part of his history were mended, an incomplete circle finally made whole. "It's incredible that we found each other again," he whispered at last. "Of all people, in all places, right at the moment when you needed it most," Mrs. Esther finished tenderly, clasping his hand in hers. Her wise eyes met his with unwavering compassion. "You were always a special boy, Richard. I knew someday you'd find your way back to what truly matters." For the first time since receiving his diagnosis, Richard no longer feared death. He knew that even if he were gone, his story would continue through Maya, Lily, and Mrs. Esther, a legacy of love surpassing physical existence. In the days that followed, Richard and Mrs. Esther shared stories of their past with the twins, who listened intently, enthralled by the tales of when Mr. Calloway was little. For them, this newly uncovered connection was a kind of miracle, confirming their childish belief in destiny and perfect circles. Richard asked his assistant to search through the family archives for any photos of him with Esther. They found one, yellowed with age, a roughly 7-year-old Richard seated beside a young Esther Goldman, both smiling for the camera in a flower garden. When he showed the photo to the twins, they insisted it be placed in a special frame and added to the memory wall they kept in the living room. As his health deteriorated further, Richard became increasingly dependent on a wheelchair and home medical care. Still, he insisted on staying in contact with the twins, receiving them at his apartment or, on his better days, paying brief visits to Mrs. Esther's new house. One afternoon, as the girls played in the yard, Richard handed Mrs. Esther a sealed envelope. "For when I'm no longer here," he explained simply. "Not before then, please." "I promise," she replied, accepting the envelope with reverence and placing it in a drawer of her desk. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Richard and Mrs. Esther sat on the porch for what would be the last time. Fall was well underway, a chill in the air necessitating blankets over their laps and steaming mugs of tea. "I don't think I'll be able to come here again," Richard admitted, his voice weaker than he would have liked. "The doctors want me to stay home now." Mrs. Esther nodded, understanding all that was left unsaid. The end was near. "Then we'll come to you," she answered simply. Richard smiled, grateful for the absence of drama or pity. "I'd like that." The stars shone brightly above, as if the universe was putting on a final show just for them. Richard gazed upward, recalling the astronomy books he'd shared with the girls, the constellations they'd learned. "So you know what strikes me the most?" he asked, breaking the companionable silence. "It's not that I'm dying, but how much time I spent merely existing without truly living." Mrs. Esther clasped his hand, the same hands that had once comforted a lonely boy. "But these last few months," Richard continued, "have been the most genuine of my life. Strange, isn't it, that I had to face death to really start living? Many people never make that discovery, even with a whole lifetime ahead of them," she answered gently. "Perhaps time isn't measured in days or years, but in moments of true connection." Richard nodded, absorbing her wisdom. "Then I've lived more in these months than in the previous 40 years. "Exactly." They fell silent for a long while, simply watching the stars and listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant bark of a dog. There was a stark simplicity to this moment, yet it seemed to hold the meaning of the universe. "Thank you," Richard whispered at last, voice almost trembling. "For what?" "For finding me. Twice. For reminding me of what really matters. For giving me a family in my final days." Mrs. Esther squeezed his hand. "It's a perfect circle, Richard. You came into my life when I needed purpose after losing my sister. You returned when you needed to rediscover love before leaving. Perhaps we should be the ones thanking you." In the following week, as the doctors had warned, Richard became confined to his bed. His opulent apartment, once a monument to wealth, was gently transformed by the presence of items that reminded him of Mrs. Esther and the twins, bright drawings on the walls, living plants by the windows, framed photographs on tables where once there had only been abstract sculptures. The visits continued, adapted to his condition. The twins would sit cautiously on the edge of his bed, sharing stories of their day, presenting new drawings, sometimes simply reading to him when he was too tired to speak. They understood, with the intuitive grasp children often have, that their friend was saying goodbye. They didn't ask when he'd get better or when he'd be back at the park. They simply accepted and tried to make each visit meaningful. One clear autumn afternoon, with golden leaves dancing in the wind outside the window, Richard Calloway passed away peacefully, Mrs. Esther's hand in his. The twins had visited earlier that day, bringing a new drawing for the memory album they had compiled together. His funeral was small and modest, as per his instructions. Mrs. Esther and the girls attended, dressed not in black but in bright colors. They insisted Mr. Calloway would like. A week later, at the reading of the will, there were no surprises for Mrs. Esther. She already knew all the measures Richard had taken to secure Maya and Lily's future. The trust funds for their education, health and welfare had been set up meticulously, in keeping with everything he did. What did surprise many, however, was the large fund established for the entire neighborhood. Money for improving local schools, green spaces, and community programs. "So other children can have the kind of childhood Maya and Lily do," read the explanation letter, "to build a place where no one has to be alone." When the time felt right, Mrs. Esther finally opened the envelope Richard had entrusted to her, with instructions to only read it after his passing. Inside there was a handwritten letter, his careful penmanship revealing that he had taken his time. "Dear Esther, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But I leave with a peace I never imagined possible. A piece I owe to you and the girls. Thank you for reminding me what love is. For showing me, not once but twice in my life, that human connection is the only legacy that truly matters. My final investment wasn't in stocks or real estate or businesses, but in a family I never knew I had until I ran into you in the park. A family that welcomed me without judgment, teaching me more about living in a few months than I learned in 40 years. Take care of the girls. Let them climb trees, feed birds, and believe in magic gardens. Tell them stories about me if you wish, not as the rich and powerful man I once was, but as someone who found his way home thanks to you. And when you look at the stars, remember that somehow, somewhere, I am looking at them too. With a love even death cannot diminish, Richard, Mrs. Esther folded the letter carefully, silent tears streaming down her time-worn cheeks. Later that evening, once the twins were asleep, she added the letter to the memory book they had all contributed to, placing it beside the old photograph Richard had found. The following spring, as the girls' garden bloomed once again, Maya noticed something unusual, a variety of flowers she didn't remember planting, growing right where they had scattered a portion of Richard's ashes, according to his private request. "Look, Grandma," she called, summoning Mrs. Esther. "They're the same flowers that are in Mr. Calloway's old picture. You said they grew in his mansion's garden when he was little." Mrs. Esther gazed at the small blue flowers in amazement. She had completely forgotten that detail, but Maya was right. They were blue hydrangeas, the same that had once grown in abundance on the Calloway estate decades earlier. "How did they get here?" Lily asked, awed. Mrs. Esther smiled, kneeling to touch the delicate blossoms. "Some circles never really break," she answered gently. "They just transform into something new." The girls accepted that explanation with the simple faith of childhood, returning happily to their work in the garden. Mrs. Esther lingered a moment longer, reflecting on life's mysteries and the connections that endure beyond even death. Thus, Richard's true legacy wasn't his fortune, his skyscrapers, or his corporations. It was the love and connection he finally discovered before leaving. A perfect circle that began and ended with the same extraordinary woman and 2 children who taught him to see the magic in simple things. Years later, when Maya and Lily were teenagers flipping through the memory album, now filled with many more pages of shared moments, Lily came across Richard's letter once again. "It's strange," she remarked after rereading. "Sometimes I feel like he never really left." Maya nodded, understanding perfectly. "Grandma always says that the people we love live on through our memories and the stories we tell. And through what we plant," Lily added, glancing out the window at the garden, where blue hydrangeas continued to flourish each spring, more abundant every year. From the kitchen, Mrs. Esther overheard their conversation and smiled quietly. The circle continued, the seeds Richard had planted, both literal and metaphorical, continuing to bloom. The man who spent most of his life believing that wealth was measured in bank accounts had left behind the most valuable legacy of all, a love that kept growing even after his passing. "Welcome back, Richard," she whispered to the soft sway of the blue flowers in the spring breeze. "You found your way home after all,